Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being here. My name is Sal D'Agostino. I'm the CEO of ID Machines and also co-founder of a company called Open Consent. And I'm going to be talking about operational privacy and what that means. Does everybody here realize they're in the risk management business? So we don't have to necessarily cover that ground. So that's a good start. So this is what I'm going to try and accomplish today, which is what's in the program. So a little background on privacy. What are current privacy requirements around security and surveillance systems? What's the relationship to privacy and security? How to measure privacy risk, and importantly, what I'm going to try to do today is to explain to people this concept of a public privacy profile, and how creating a public privacy profile can be a way to make privacy part of their operations, and in effect, it's one of the best ways to reduce risk. Everybody has a public profile for their companies, right? Whether you realize it, for the most part, right? It was like, does anybody here have a company that doesn't have a website, right? So everybody has something which is out there publicly, right? And the little green, everybody familiar with the little green lock, which says whether or not your website's doing HTTPS or not? If you're a consultant and you don't have a little green lock on your website and you're in the security business and you're running a website that's not HTTPS, that's a public cybersecurity profile that says your website's insecure. So there are signs that are out there for people that know what to look for, which give a very strong indication about the nature of your business. And the same thing is true when it comes to privacy. So one of the things I'll be trying to go through today is how do you establish a sort of an operational privacy profile. I'm going to look at some of the standards that exist. I'm going to take you through a risk assessment. I'm going to look at the use of cloud-based analytics, which happens to be a particular high-risk use case from a privacy perspective. Talk about the kinds of countermeasures that could be used in that particular case, and it looks like I put countermeasures on there twice, so really use countermeasures. So for the most part, background on privacy, this is kind of where it started, right? The so-called right to privacy, Brandeis, Harvard Law Review, 1890. People know why this came into place, right? It was this fancy new technology, which is called instantaneous photography, right? So technology triggered a privacy wave. Right? And the technology was the photograph. And it was the photograph of the hoi polloi in their homes. Right? And that was unacceptable to the hoi polloi, right? And so initially privacy was a thing for a certain class of people. That triggered it, but when Brandeis wrote about it, he talked about a right to privacy. And so throughout today, a lot of what I'll be talking about is this evolution of the concept of privacy rights. And really, the most important thing that you can do from a privacy perspective is making those rights operational. And the other thing I'd like to point out here is that the concepts related to privacy really sort of wax and wane over time, right? So initially, when Social Security numbers came out, it was something that you would not absolutely want to lose, right? So people got Social Security numbers tattooed on their arms, right? I don't know if you know this, right? But literally, because if something ever happened to them, that was how they could prove that they had the check coming. Right? And so the last thing anybody wanted to do was lose their Social Security numbers. So they did things like this. This is a real ad, right? Get your ring with your Social Security number engraved on it, so you'll always have that Social Security number. From a privacy perspective today, what do we say? Never expose personally identifiable information, right? So the idea of like what's private and what's not, what's sensitive and what's not, really does sort of wax and wane a little bit over time. And And so what's sensitive at the end of the day is really where this overlap exists, right? So if you think of where privacy and security come together, and this, I'll call this privacy 1.0 because I'm going to show another sort of hand-drawn version of this. But this is the way it's been looked at in the past, right? So sensitive information is something that privacy is always concerned about. But sensitive information is currently something that security has always been worried about, right? So when you're protecting assets, and that's why I put sensitive information up there instead of personal information, because I think it's much better to just think of what's sensitive, right? And so rather than getting into some idea about, well, that's a person's, it's not the company's, it doesn't matter, just begin to think about what's sensitive. And what you'll soon realize is that people's sensitive information is of concern to security professionals. But so why am I talking about this? Why is this relevant, right? So there is a privacy wave that's breaking, right? I'll get into GDPR in a second, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the U.S. because most of this audience, I think, is going to have a U.S. interest. Suddenly, are you ready for America's data protection laws? So what actually happened suddenly that, here we are, we not really any push on the federal government's part for any sort of federal regulations around privacy, right? It's been state by state, and I'll get into that a little bit. But, what actually took place and why Silicon Valley suddenly is pushing for federal privacy laws is the fact that the FTC just hit Facebook with a $5 billion fine, right? So I don't know what the motivation was, but suddenly this FTC suddenly decided that they wanted to get tough with Silicon Valley. Some of these things could be political, I guess. But this is a real thing. So now that Facebook is looking at FTC fines, state fines, GDPR fines. They're going, oh, we need federal regulation so that we can have one law that makes it easy for us. And guess what? We know about how to help craft federal regulation, so let's start pushing for federal privacy laws. So, I don't know that this comes around really quickly in terms of U.S. regulations, the equivalent of GDPR, but there certainly is a trend underway which has been triggered by the fact that some of these fines are beginning to be put in place. Privacy law in the U.S. is not an easy thing to define. The last time I checked, there were about 250 privacy laws in the U.S. that are currently relevant. It's kind of a pretty unwieldy number. There's something called the Privacy Journal. A guy puts this out every year. It's a PDF and a little printed book. It costs $45, and it's got state by state all the privacy laws that are relevant. So it's a pretty useful reference at the end of the day. I think it's actually sold out on that Amazon link. But if you look up Privacy Journal, and then you'll see the guy's picture, and then it'll refer you to an Amazon link. I think you can still get it on a Kindle. I'm happy to help people get a copy of it if there's an issue there. And this is an example. So one of the premier organizations that are out there around privacy is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. It's pretty legalistic in terms of its approach. But there's a couple of nice, so this is a graphic from them. Let me see if I can manage to work with here. Hello. So basically, remember I was talking about rights, and then you're talking about business obligations. So these are the kinds of things that you as a corporation are going to have to be, if you're a company, you're going to need to worry about. So what rights do consumers have, and what obligations do you have as a business? And then if you also look, again, just in terms of the state of privacy law in the U.S., this is tracking where this stuff is in the legislative process. So there's bills in the works in almost every state legislature in the country at this point. And this is just sort of showing you where it's going from introduced to law here. And again, you get a better version of this from, you can go to the IPP website and get it. It's showing you stuff down here in the bottom. Hawaii, Maine, New York. All these things are ready to go. These are in session. it's happening everywhere, right? So when I talk about a privacy wave, I think there's a lot of examples out there in the world of them, right? And then there's also the facial recognition bans that are going into place, right? People familiar with these, right, for the most part? Yeah, the picture is the body-worn cameras, which are for facial rec, which are legislation in California to ban the use of FR in police body-worn cameras. There's also legislation in these other states. Berkeley, California, and Somerville, Massachusetts have actually passed laws prohibiting the use of facial recognition systems in public places. So there is a whole slew of legislation that's out there that's either in the works or underway. And then, as far as in the EU, this stuff has already happened, right? So bear with me if I can pull this off. So we go to the privacy. So this is the GDPR. So if you go to enforcementtracker.com, you've got this list of GDPR fines. And in case people didn't think that there have been GDPR fines, there's 10 pages of them, right? And this is just sort of showing you, latest one was 4 days ago, right? So, Romania, Greece, every country around the world, or in every country in the EU, slowly but surely, right, is beginning to put stuff on this list. Yeah, Spain, Austria, France, United Kingdom, there's, you get enforcement to work, there's revenue that's associated with it, right? So this is ongoing, and some of these fines have been significant, right? So if you've got an international business, you've got international clients, you need to know this stuff is for real, and it's really underway in the EU. But if you can deal with GDPR, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape with dealing with it, whatever's coming down the pike in the US. So let me get back to this mode here. Slowly but surely. Thank you, Bill Gates. But it's not easy, right? So, you'd think a company like Google would have the resources to understand GDPR, right? One would assume. They probably have the resources, motivation is probably a separate issue. But this is Google's privacy policy. The updated version of our privacy policy takes effect on May 25th, 2018, which of course was the day after the GDPR enforcement went into effect. GDPR actually went into effect 2 years prior to that, but the fines for it only kicked in on May 24th of last year. Yet, Google's policy that they just updated on the day after the GDPR went into effect said to opt out of personal ads. Guess what? That's against the law, according to GDPR. So literally, Google updated their privacy policy the day after GDPR went into effect, and they did it in a way in which they were non-compliant. So don't feel bad, necessarily, depending on what your level of understanding is around this. But, not everybody gets this right. But, opt-in is the only way you're supposed to be collecting personal information at this point. And one of the other points about this is just sort of I don't know whether you call it style points, or it's my personal opinion about things. It's impossible to get someone's consent in a process if you start out with them under surveillance. So you go to a website and you're being tracked, and now you're being asked, what do you want us to do about your privacy? Right, so the initial conditions for the engagement, often, for me, in terms of this public privacy profile, is just something else that's indicative about how serious a company is about it. Because if you start by surveilling people to then ask them what they think about surveillance, people have already gotten an answer to what you really think about surveillance. And this goes on all the time now. I mean, I can't tell you how many people's websites will absolutely be collecting data when they give you the option about whether or not you want them to be collecting your data. So, so as a result, the problem that's become is that many people are beginning to think we live in a world like this, right, in which surveillance is run rampant, and that as security professionals, we're the bad people, right? But the fact of the matter is, from a physical security surveillance perspective, you'll hear me talk a few times about the purpose and justification. That is always the place that you start when you look to do this stuff. From a privacy risk perspective, video surveillance for public safety is actually low risk. And the reason that it's low privacy risk is because there's a purpose and a justification which is almost always written into the law. So if you look at GDPR, you've got the right to collect, to set up video surveillance for public safety. Now that doesn't, and you don't need people's consent to do that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't certain other requirements that are still necessary for you to provide. And most importantly would be notice, right? And I'm going to get into some of this again. But there are other things in the world that are sort of driving this pushback, right? So again, it was. You go back to Brandeis, and it was the instantaneous photography or photography in general that triggered a set of privacy legislation. You're seeing a series of events around the world now in which the level of surveillance is 1984-esque. I think you could easily say that. And the panopticon, people familiar with that? It's the Jeremy Bentham back in the 19th century. It was basically, it was your surveillance system dashboard, effectively, right? So the panopticon was this device that you could look into, and it was like a set of mirrors that you could see everything that was going on everywhere, right? And they talked about having a jail where the guy could look in the panopticon, and basically it was the dashboard with 100 screens that you really can't really tell what's going on anyway. But it's a very old concept that also was in place, and those kinds of discussions were occurring when the whole Brandeis wave of stuff came into play. Same thing, I don't know if people have ever seen this, and people know enough about what's going on in China. You see it on the news every day. But this BBC piece on the level of tech, are people familiar with the social credit system that exists in China at this point? Right? So literally, the level of surveillance that's taking place in China has evolved to the point where they actually track how much toilet paper you use in a bathroom, in a public bathroom, right? That kind of level of surveillance is going to create a pushback. And so the reason that the reason that I've invested in this technology, that I care about it as a security professional, is because I know this is coming. You can tell what's coming, and you can see the pushback coming. You can see the legislation that's underway. And the events that are out there in the world have this sort of surveillance 2.0, and then there's also a lot of reactions to that. So for me, this is a fun one, right? So I don't know if people are familiar with, and so that's anti-license plate reading dresses and clothing that you can wear, right? So this is makeup that defeats facial recognition. These are facial recognition glasses that don't have you run afoul of the fact that a mask is illegal in some places, right? So you're not allowed to wear a mask, but just as good when it comes from a facial rec perspective, right? So it's interesting the reactions that are out there in the world, some of which take this approach, others take a legislative approach. But I also think that what we need is sort of a professional business, legal, and technical approach as security professionals, right? I always talk about that sandwich. People familiar with the BLT, right? So when you're looking at risk or you're looking at operational requirements, making sure that you have the business, legal, and technical aspects of something is really, really critical. And so just looking at that. So if you look at the way Privacy 1.0, what I'll refer to, took place, it was this. It was terms and conditions on your privacy policy, right? And those are wonderful things, right? The unusable multi-page agreement, which you basically click I agree, and then you go onto the website, and then you become the product. Breach notifications, privacy notices after the fact, and encryption, right? That's the way that privacy more or less has been done up till now. And so what we'd say, I'm sorry, wrong way. So privacy 2.0, as far as the way we look at it, is this idea of data transparency, which again is related to the public privacy profile that I was talking about, and also data control. But the difference here is that this needs to be, we talk about things being transparent, but they also need to be reciprocal, and they need to be proportional. So if you think the way that most privacy policies work today, the level of their transparency is minimal. The level of reciprocity is basically nil, and the proportionality is a completely one-sided thing. It's all terms and conditions written for basically the organization and not the individual, right? So if you're going to begin to practice this, I did that again. We talk about openness, usability, and relevance being the things that need to matter, right? So the more open you are, we would say the more trusted you are, right? And the more trusted you are, the better your brand, right? Usability is critical because the current privacy policies are absolutely not. So how do you create operational privacy that has some usable aspect to it? And how is it relevant to the individual, right? The terms and conditions you got weren't relevant to you at all, right? They're relevant to the organization. And again, if there's this sort of needs to be this balance of reciprocity in place, you're going to need to have something for the person in the process. And I would say a lot of this sort of, ID machines, a lot of this is around this rubric of identity. And so what I'm going to try to do a little bit now is show you how to actually do some of this privacy 2.0 stuff. And for me, again, if you remember the earlier drawing, I would say it's now focusing on user rights. So before, you were looking at the terms and conditions. Today, what I would say that you need to do is, most importantly, you need to make available and operational those user rights. If you remember in the other drawing, which was from the IAPP, and I'll get there in a second. Oops. It's making operational these things. Access to the collected data, access to what's shared, rectification if there's any mistakes, right to delete, right to restrict, knowledge about the level of portability, opt out, solely automated, and privacy right of action. So those are examples of these rights that I'm talking about here. So let me get back down to that. That I believe you're going to need to make operational. These user rights that you're going to need to make operational if you really want to try to get on the front foot when it comes to privacy. So as an example, if you look at a current architecture, and I'm not trying to pick on Milestone, they just happen to have a nice drawing. Nothing about the user anywhere in this picture. Right, so here's a surveillance system, and there's no way that the user is involved anywhere, right? So if nothing else, I would say, okay, so how do you notify users about the level of surveillance that's taking place, right? If you go through any of the current surveillance systems that are out there, almost nothing talks about interaction with the people who are being surveilled, right? It's all about the technology to gather that information in. So this is an example where proportionality in architecture is also relevant, right? So there's no consideration of the individual here. And it's and the other challenge in the physical security world is if you look at all the different owners in an organization and where data goes, right? So you've got So from analytics, I'm happy to give you this chart, but these are different owners of data in an enterprise when you're talking about a surveillance system, right? Or a physical access control system. So it's all over the place, and none of this is the user again. So now you've got all these different individuals gathering personally identifiable information, supposedly controlling it, and so how do you get that toothpaste back in the tube, right? I'd say you need to do something like, begin to just consider the user in the design of this process, right? So how would you do that? And I may take this out to get a little better picture here. So I'm going to take you through this step by step. So this is how we would actually do the risk assessment and create this profile, and I'm going to take you through it one step at a time. The first thing you have to do is understand the jurisdiction that you're operating in, right? And they could be multiple, but that's the first thing you establish is what's the jurisdiction. So in this particular case, I'm just going to take GDPR. So suddenly we all got transported from New Mexico to this, I don't know, pick your favorite EU member country, right? Belgium, they like their beer. So now we're in Belgium, and now the rights that you need to recognize are defined in the GDPR, right? So now I've got a jurisdiction, I know the laws that apply, I know the requirements that exist. So the next thing you need to do is you need to figure out whether or not you've got any special considerations. So, what might be special considerations when it comes to processing with surveilling individuals?
Record.
Yeah. So identification of people in general is one. So if you're going to automatically identify people, so automatic data processing is a special consideration in the EU. So any analytics which is used, any automated decision-making on the part of a security system triggers a special condition under the GDPR, right? Children, right? I talk about the perfect storm of a GDPR data case as automated facial recognition of kids in a school with a cloud-based system that's processing their data in another country. And as weird as that sounds, that's actually not that unusual a use case at the end of the day. But now you're starting to tick off. You've ticked off the you're ticking off the across borders, you're clicking off children, you're clicking off automated data processing. So the first thing you want to understand is, have you ticked off any of these high risk categories or what we refer to as special considerations? And then the next thing that you need to look at is, are you sharing this data with anyone, right? So that's the next level of risk that you need to look at. So suddenly I've got personally identifiable information and I'm sharing it with someone else, or for whatever reason, my supply chain requires that data to go from individual to individual. So you've got these special conditions that relate to the context and the use case, and then you've got special conditions related to the nature of the information flow itself. So this is the second thing that you need to look at in your risk assessment is, to what extent are you actually sharing any of that information? And every time you share that information, your level of risk goes up.
So, if I may.
Sure.
So that sharing also applies to contract levels, right?
Completely.
Vendors and so on and so forth.
Yep. Yeah. Anytime a third party, apart from yourself, anytime anyone apart from the data controller, which is kind of my punchline at the end here, but so you've got a data controller, you've got processors, and you've got sub-processors, right? That's kind of the chain of command in an operational privacy framework. So your supply chain very often for the data controller didn't build their home-built video surveillance system, right? And it's one of the things that I get, the hair up on the back of my neck when I start hearing people talk about our product is GDPR compliant. Well, it can't be. Because the GDPR doesn't apply to technology, it applies to data controllers. So every time you see someone said, "Hi, we've got this GDPR seal of approval," okay, fine. Now what happens when someone uses your product and starts, sharing personal information with a third party that they shouldn't have otherwise? It didn't matter what your stamp said. So the idea of understanding the responsibilities of a data controller as security professionals, and whether it's as a consultant, you've got a customer who's deploying a surveillance system and you want to identify who that data controller is, or you're a vendor who's going to supply a data controller with technology. How you get them to act operationally is really, really, really important, and you should be helping them go through this process to help understand that, right? And then the mitigation. So what happens then as a result? We keep going here. All right. Again, establish a, so you need to establish whatever the service is. You need the purpose of use, the justification, and so those are the high-level things that we would have done just before. So now we're going its next step, right? So currently, people have done a better job around cyber, right? And one of the things that they've done when companies have done a better job around cyber is that they've actually had a point of contact. So if I have a cybersecurity problem, who's my cybersecurity point of contact? So a privacy point of contact is effectively the same thing. Very often that can be the data controller, but it's an individual that you can go to. So now you're trying to build in some of this reciprocity that I was talking about, right? How do you get to a situation where an individual can actually do something with you, right? How can they actually ask for something? Actually having registered, so if you're in the EU again, or if you're in a GDPR-related country, there's information commissioners' offices in every one of those countries. So the other thing that you should clearly be doing is registering with the ICO. I mean, that's their acronym. Again, if I'm looking at a company and who's operating in England, I'm going to go to the ICO's website and I'm going to do a data lookup to see if that company's registered with the ICO. If they haven't done that, another red flag in their public privacy profile, right? And again, these are things you can help customers, or we can help you help customers, you can help customers, or customers can help themselves, but they should just be going through this process, right? So identify the service, understand your purpose and the justification, establish a point of contact for it, register your organization, and then have some persistent privacy endpoint, right? So that's either going to be a landing page, which is typically /privacy, or it can have, which in most cases is simply a privacy policy. We think you can actually do more, and I'll give you an example of a mock-up of what we think that looks like. But the point is that there's a consistent place that people can know that you can go. And that's really important because one of the things I'll be talking about in a second is the importance of notice. And so if you're going to give somebody a notice that says, here's what's going on with your privacy, if you need to be able to point them to some place if they have any additional questions. And if you've got a persistent URL, you can create a QR code as an example that will take them right back to that website. And if you've got something on that website, then they can, they could do a little self-help. You may, based on that risk assessment, have triggered certain requirements in the GDPR context, certain obligations, right? So, and the obligations are, if you're above a certain size, I think it's 250 employees, you need to do a data privacy impact assessment, right? So that's a special condition based on the size of the company, right? So, that letting your customers know if they're in the EU, if they're a global 1,000, they probably know that they should have done this, but we still find quite a few gaps. So that's the DPIA. The DPO, the Data Protection Officer, is another special condition if you're above a certain size, if you're doing certain kinds of processing, you have a certain volume of data, you actually have to have a Data Protection Officer, right? That can be your data controller, or it can be a different individual. But under certain conditions, you need to have one. And then the last part here is where I think there's a real opportunity for the industry, is that in many of these cases, nobody's telling you exactly what to do. So there's no, currently, no set of conditions that say, if you want to do video surveillance in the EU, here's how to go do it, right? There is, as an example, in the United Kingdom, a surveillance commissioner. And that surveillance commissioner has a surveillance code of conduct. And that code of conduct has for it a series of practices for license plate reading, body-worn cameras, and all sorts of other categories. So the way this is rolled out in Europe is that certain countries or certain organizations, that was the British Standards and then the British Security Industry Association, worked together to put that code of conduct together. We need to be doing the same thing here, right? And we're actually beginning to do, and we've done a little bit of work with the Security Industry Association to begin to promote this. I'm actually helping them. I'm helping them to develop a code of conduct, which is basically adapting some of the ones that already exist out there in the world for, why reinvent the wheel? There's already a surveillance commissioner. There's already these codes of practices. You can take a lot from what already exists to develop those kinds of code of conducts and codes of practice, and then a certification program. But the certification program, again, is not around the product, it's around the practice. And it's around the practice of the data controller or the data privacy officer in general. And when you're at the end of that, you got to put in place controls, right? So everybody familiar with the concept of security controls, right? More or less, kind of, it's like use multi-factor authentication, ISO 27002 with the security controls. The NIST cybersecurity framework is a bunch of security controls. For the federal government, special publication 853 is security controls. And if you look at any of these control sets that are out there now, they've now become security and privacy controls, right? And some of the privacy controls are reasonable, but they're also relatively new. And in many cases, the risk frameworks that are applying them, again, are very enterprise-centric. So if you look at any of the privacy controls that NIST is evolving at this point, again, very few of them are actually taking the approach that I'm suggesting, which is focusing it from a user rights perspective backwards. That doesn't mean those controls aren't valid. I would just say that maybe you should look at those controls in a little bit more balanced way. But what you clearly need to do is, if you've got anything that's high risk, you've got to identify how you're going to mitigate it, right? And you should be putting a time frame, and you should have the legal, technical, and business framework to apply that, right? So ISO 29000 is the ISO privacy framework that's evolving. It's not bad, actually. And we've helped contribute to it. I'll show you something at the end related to that. Immediate 90 days low or none, right? And so this runs completely contrary to the whole big data, cloud-based approach to life, because high risk, one of the high risk categories is a high volume of data, right? So that's not to say that you shouldn't be using big data. And this is, in the earlier presentation, Mark, by the way, did a great job, and it was a really good panel. But you need to understand that it's high risk. And so, who engages in a high-risk activity without eyes wide open about it, and without some framework to address that risk? I think in many, many cases today, when we're dealing with a lot of these use cases, nobody has gone down that path to begin to identify or put together a matrix of something along these lines. And this is the other point that was also made in your panel, is that just do a little bit of this, And you're so much better off than everybody else because most other people are doing nothing. It's completely you're in the woods with your friend and you run into the bear. The only thing that matters is that you're faster than your friend, right? Because the slowest person is the one that's going to get caught by the information commissioner, right? So that whole list of GDPR fines, those were you're either really high profile or you're a complete sluggard. You're completely sloughing it off. Because they don't, right now, well, at this point in time, they don't have that many resources, right? The information commissioner offices are not like a police department with 1,000 privacy cops that are going to go out there. They've got a limited number of people. That may grow as these fines come in, and then they can begin to staff with those fines and add more people to the information commissioner's office. But for the time being, it's really only if you really screw it up are you going to have your feet held to the fire. So if you just do a little bit of what I'm talking about here, you're going to be much better off than the other 99% of the world that isn't doing that. So I'm now going to take you through a little bit of what that looks like from a cloud use case, if I can get this to work, right? So cloud-based video analytics use case, right? So immediately you're in a high-risk category, right? Because if in the GDPR context you got automated data processing, you got cloud-based processing, both of those things can be triggers, right? So you need to look then at those two different risk paths, right? I'm going to use I'm going to take the video analytics first, right? So are you using video analytics? No, good, pass go, collect $200. If you are, you need to, GDPR articles 22, 35, and 47 suddenly come into play, which means, again, go back to that risk matrix that I just showed you. Acknowledge that you're doing this automated processing. Give notice of automated processing. That's one of those articles say. So if you're going to do this, have a sign, make it obvious. That's a lot. As someone who put a license plate reader in a tunnel in London in 1979, and I put a facial recognition system in Heathrow in 1986. I have known for a very long time that the way that those systems, or whether I was, doing toll enforcement and reading license plates in Florida, or wherever I've been deploying these systems for the last 40 years, the thing that I always knew that we needed to do, and in fact, I think we did a pretty good job of it in all those cases, was letting the public know what was going on. And what that fundamentally is just giving notice about the nature of the processing that's taking place. So, and that's the biggest way for you to get hung up in this world, is not to give notice. Buy the damn $2 sign and stick it on the door at eye level so that people can see it, right? And just say, video surveillance in use. If nothing else, we can help you develop much better versions of that sign with the QR code or an NFC tag and all sorts of fun stuff with an app. But if nothing else, you want to give notice that this is the case. So that's almost the biggest piece of information. Then the question becomes, okay, so what are those analytics doing? Oops, I'm back. Right? Yeah. Are they doing identification, right? So if they're actually identifying people, now you've just crossed another threshold. Are you using video analytics based on a thermal camera that's simply tracking traffic? Not that much to worry about. Or I'm doing a video analytics use case again that's tracking kids in school. Oops, now I've crossed the identification. Right, so you've got raw video, you've got sort of categorization, you've got classification, and you've got identifications. There's a whole pipeline that analytics works on where you go from pictures to personally identifiable information. So you need to understand where you are along that spectrum, and if you don't need it, don't use it. This is and there is this push-pull that's really going on today between, I got to get the big data, the metadata is the new oil, right? And privacy breaches are the equivalent of the Exxon Valdez, right? There are risks, right? And you better know how to address those at the end of the day. It gets even worse, right? So video analytics, and I'm sharing it with a third party, right? Whoa, right? Another huge red flag in that case. Sorry for that. Right? And did it go cross-border? So now after you've done all this classification, these are the things that you may need to put in place, right? So you look at a service agreement, look at a data processing agreement, look at the cross-border measures that are involved, look at subcontractor measures, look at the transparency notices as necessary for this. So, my experience is when people are deploying these kinds of systems, very seldom are these things called out. And it's only after the fact that when, to your point, get the lawyers in there early, get all the stakeholders in there early. You don't want to try to put this on tag this on the back of something. Sorry. And the other path is a little easier, right? So just continue based on purpose, justification, not. So if you're not actually doing any analytics, but you're just doing cloud-based video processing, you go back to the other diagram that I was going through and just understand justification, purpose, and these other things. You probably didn't trigger any of those special conditions, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't continue to deal with whatever the operational requirements are. Then as a result of that, update your risk assessment, update your security and public policy profile, and you're done. Anybody have any questions at this point? I can keep going.
Are there any benchmarks for the time and effort to achieve these by sort of application or business category? So if you've got to go through that process and work it through, you've got a video, you're storing video to the cloud, you're doing a minimal level of analytics that you're using in-house,
right?
And you're in Europe, or you're in the US, but you have a lot of European visitors.
Right. So the European visitors, so jurisdiction is where the camera is, right? So European visitors going by your camera in New Mexico, what you need to do is let them know you're not in Europe anymore, Dorothy. The local laws apply. The only place where that gets a little tricky is if you then use that information to market to them back at home, right? So if you use that information to then market to a person who's covered under GDPR, then you've triggered something. Otherwise, they're here. It's the local law.
Even if it's a European company with a U.S. position, or U.S. company with a European position.
That's my current understanding. I mean, that doesn't mean that you couldn't adopt the GDPR as best practice for your company or solution wherever it is, but technically the jurisdiction is where the camera's in place, unless again the data flows to these other locations. Mark?
I think one good point to make on that is the jurisdiction being static. Right? If you're going to pass PII from one jurisdiction to another, then those rules don't apply.
Exactly.
If you're driving at it, right? Now, if you're going to be bringing that PII over into the U.S., then GDPR applies. If you're going to bring that information from the U.S. back to Europe, as your comment, then GDPR applies.
Yeah, and more, as you get into, oh, sorry, back in the middle.
No. When you talk,
Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah, I'll repeat the questions and I'll hand out microphones from now on. Sorry for that. I mean, sorry?
Passing a pineapple against Jay's lines, that's what his question was. Would that be passive piece of proof
right? So yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the case, Mark, right? So if, it depends where the data flows go. And if the data flows into the EU, and the thing is that if you look at an enterprise security system, enterprise systems they're pretty widespread, right? So there is kind of, and the other thing, if you look at physical access control or physical security systems in general, they happen to be kind of gluttony when it comes to personally identifiable information, right? So, you build, I mean, I don't know, and the nature of the information is such that, you're pushing stuff down to field panels with local databases. I don't know how wise people are when they push stuff down to a local field panel. Ideally, you would just have an identifier and an access control list. But you wouldn't have John Doe, company, John Doe, 37-bit and company code. Just have the company code in 37-bit and whatever door groups that they're allowed into. But you see people replicating. The other thing, if you look at if you remember the milestone architecture, which is the same as anybody's architecture, you got all these servers, right? And all those servers are all collecting personally identifiable information, more or less. So there's a lot of risk in these systems just because there's so much data that's being gathered. And I think that so the concept of privacy by design or consent by design or even security by design, the concept of data minimization is something that I think people need to adhere to. And that's a little contrary to the big data use case, right? So I think the big data is a different application for the most part than access control or video surveillance. And so understand the use case that you're serving and try to craft a data policy that's respective of that use case, I think, is the most important thing at the end of the day. Let's see if I can keep this going. So, I'll flick up. So we actually did an analysis of 120 different countries' privacy policies and looked at all the different sort of requirements around the world. And again, IAPP had their list. We sort of have this here, and the two things that you see, a lot of things are almost everywhere, but the two things that are absolutely everywhere is this concept of notice, which I was referring to earlier, right? So it doesn't matter if you've got the justification of public safety to be able to do this stuff. That still doesn't mean that you need to give people, that still doesn't exclude the requirement for giving notice to people about the nature of what's taking place. And the other is that in almost all these cases, there is a condition when you're dealing with something that's related to my information that you're going to do something with it, that the concept of consent comes into play. So if there's anything that I would suggest that you need to be careful about in the beginning or begin to figure out how to design in is to what extent is consent required and to what extent are you actually providing people with notice. For me, that's as important as anything else. The other categories obviously matter, but notice and consent for us are the most crucial thing as far as we're concerned.
So,
Yes, sir.
I can wait for the microphone, or you can medium-sized question.
Sure.
So I think as soon as you start talking about consent, that's where you go back to another concept that you introduced earlier, which is usability. And I'm thinking of all of us, because we're all users, right?
Right.
And it's very difficult to keep track of all of the things on all of the sites and all of the businesses that you work with, much less, it's even hard to keep track of the features of your phone and your car, right? And so you come into contact with thousands of digital entities.
Yeah, you may have to turn the mic on.
I can't say all that again.
Just continue where you started.
All right. So anyway, how does consent intersect with usability, and are there approaches to satisfying that need?
Right. So that's a really good question, Steve. And there's different levels of consent. There's explicit consent. There's implied consent. There's assumed consent. and there's no consent. And our solution to that is my next slide. Whenever you interact in some sort of exchange, usually what do you get at the end of it, right? You get a receipt. So you give something to someone, it's not unusual for you to get a receipt in return. So how do you keep track of all the stuff you've ever bought over the course of the year? You go to your American Express end of year statement, and you've got a receipt for everything that you've done over the course of the year. You can't be expected to remember who you transacted with, but except for the fact that they gave you a receipt of some kind, that gives you the information that's associated with the nature of that exchange. So our approach to that is to our approach to this, which is something we thought about two, 3 years ago, which is now making its way into an international standard called Online Privacy Notices and Consent. And Appendix B in this document, Steve, is the consent receipt that my partner in Open Consent actually wrote and is now forthcoming into its international standard. So you could have a notice receipt. Right, so the notice receipt says, hi, we're doing video surveillance. So when we engineer sort of like the next generation notice, we have a QR code. You go to a website, you have an app. That website says, here's the justification and purpose, and here are the notifications or the receipt types that we're required to provide you with. And then basically what we suggest and what we've architected for people to be able to do is for them to then be able to download and hold a receipt. And I think very soon what you're going to see is people beginning to have these blockchain-like wallets where they will have their own little personal privacy receipt blockchain in their wallet that they can use exactly for those purposes, right? So you have so just like you had a ledger in your credit card account, you should have a ledger of the privacy receipts or the notice receipts or the consent receipts for all your interactions with all the places on the net that you transact. Now, today, that's a pipe dream. But again, I think 5 years from now, what you're going to find is that for people to be ISO certified from a privacy perspective or compliant in a lot of other countries and a lot of other regimes, you're going to see this concept of a receipt actually being the way to achieve what you're thinking or asking about. Does that make sense? Or does that answer your question? Or
It answers part of my question. So I'm still thinking, okay, the receipts and the ledger are a convenient way of at least having all of my consents and notices in one place. So that's a big step forward because now they're at least organized. They're not just laying in a shoebox somewhere. They're in order, they're chronological, all the rest of that. My challenge comes with thinking about the complexity of the things that one would have to know about in order to grant consent. So let's just say for the sake of argument that all of the entities out there might have 100 different attributes of your person or your business that they wish to do something with, and they each have 100 different types of things that they might wish to do with it. You very quickly get into combinatoric numbers that are impossible for a human to rationally deal with and make decisions about.
Yeah, but every time they share your personal data, they should be generating a data receipt around with the collection of attributes that were shared under those circumstances, assuming you had given them the right to share that information. We both like standards, right? You've chaired SIA standards. I've tried to haul as much water as I can in the effort there. There's a standard, which is an OASIS standard, which is called the COAL, which is a classification of everyday life. And it's this actual set of it's literally a list of all the personal attributes you could ever think you might ever have. And it's a very very cool thing. And the combination of those attributes are something that they call atoms. So what you're talking about is a receipt for the atoms that were associated with that. So when we are constructing these receipts, we've actually looked at that Cole standard and incorporated it as for an attribute set that sort of have the relevant information. We also suggest that that be digitally signed by the data controller and notarized. So you've got a timestamp and you've got a digital signature on that receipt. And then what that enables you to do is that you can then take that back to the data controller. And in that receipt will have the attributes that were shared and the rights that you have. So the way that we look at this is that, well, now this is how I can automate this operationally. I can take that receipt, if you take it to the data controller registries that we're building, and anybody else could as well, you put that receipt, you literally take that receipt from your wallet, you put it on the website, go here, it recognizes a signature, it looks at the privacy rights you have, and it automatically generates a drop-down menu where you can exercise whatever rights you have related to that receipt. So there is a way within this structure to try to make it easy for you to understand what it is that you've shared and the nature of that sharing, and also for organizations to actually interact with you in the process of doing that. I'll give you one more, then I'll go back behind, because it looks like you've got a comment to my comment.
So the question is this: do you foresee a future where a person could, let's say, decide, I don't want to share attribute number 79 anymore with anybody, and basically en masse enforce that policy?
Yep. Yes. Yeah, I mean, you would need a smart wallet to do that, right? So that's where the client app. If you think of the wallet as a client app, you need a smart client app that could go look through your receipts, all the receipts that hold that attribute, then take all those receipts, take each of those receipts to the respective data controller sites that they were issued by, and that can all be an automated process, right? So the scale of this stuff requires automation. No ifs, ands, or buts. But I think that the sort of the overall structure, the idea of this being open, the idea of a data controller, the idea of sort of understanding the risk assessments, the idea of receipts. I mean, that's the way that we're trying to engineer it, and other people have as well. Sir.
So my question is, building off of everything that you just said right there to the next level, is that receipt only one way? There's no bidirectional, like.
So it's a digitally signed document, so it's fixed, right? So you can't modify it, but you can share it with anybody, right?
So so there is no way to really authenticate both ways. It's only just pulling.
It's just yours.
One direction.
Right. So you would authenticate. The wallet would authenticate. Right. When you interact with the data controller can have an authentication process for you as an individual.
When that wallet looks at that receipt.
Let me point something out. But it's even better if you don't need that.
Right.
So you being in possession of the receipt means that you have certain rights related to that receipt. Now, sure, how does if someone else comes in possession of one of your receipts and they suddenly start doing stuff, the good news is that you get another receipt at the end of that and it comes to you. So if someone else starts doing stuff, you're going to find, the way it's currently architected, you would find out fairly quickly.
And that was actually going to be my second question, is what do you do about like these digital breadcrumbs?
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, no, I mean, like, what is the solution?
So that's where distributed ledgers and those kinds of things come into play, right?
So it's not sitting in one single repository.
So yeah, so if you've got them on a ledger, there's slightly more immutable. But none of if we had this completely knocked, I'd be demoing the thing that I just raised $100 million for. But I think we're pretty far along in creating stuff that kind of works a little bit better than it does today.
And those are our questions, or just kind of what are the thought processes?
Yep, sure. So, does this keep on still working? Hello? we created this document with the Security Industry Association. It's got a whole bunch of references in it that you can go look. A lot of the stuff that I referred to about the UK Privacy Commissioner, the body-worn camera, license plate reading, code of conduct. It's a year old and it's a fast-moving field, but go look this up online. It's free to download, and it'll give you a pretty exhaustive. I think there's maybe 50 or more, pretty useful from what we think, references around code of conduct standards, decent PowerPoint presentations, various other places to look. And that's most of what I had from the slide deck. Oh, I had a couple other fun things, actually, I was going to. So, and again, just how stuff has evolved, right? So, I've been doing a lot of fun reading. So, yeah, this is how facial recognition has evolved, right? So, in the old days, you could. Evidently, they thought that the facial recognition system was even more advanced. So these old facial recognition systems were more advanced even than the ones today, because no facial recognition system out there today can tell you whether or not your husband's a genuine husband or an unreliable husband based on the shape of their head, right? Or the fact that that very early on, you had all these measurements, right? So this is where a lot of the whole biometric stuff came from. It was like trying to characterize people's personalities back in the 19th century. So that's just a couple of fun pictures. The other thing I'll show you is kind of what the privacy control and operational stuff actually looks like. So if you go to my website, I don't mean to be doing that, and you go to my privacy policy, first of all, we don't collect any information on our website. So when you go through each of these things, we say who we are. So if you blow this up, what personal data do we collect and why we collect it? We don't collect any. We actually say on our website, if you want to get in touch with us, send us an email. Websites are not built for exchanging personal information, right? If you want to do business with us, get in touch with us. We'd love to talk to you. Why would you use a website to exchange personal information? It's where all this stuff goes wrong. Now, we're not suggesting that everybody take this approach, but for a company like ours, I don't have a need to take on that privacy risk. I would rather just hand someone my business card or have them or send us an email. Maybe I'm missing a few sales as a result, but at the same time, I think what we're trying to do is build a trustworthy brand. The other thing that we've done is to create a more usable. So not only have I tried to craft here what I believe a sort of a useful privacy policy for people, and go to our website, idmachine/privacy, and you can see this. But we've actually begun to implement some of the open consent technology. So a privacy issue is basically when what you expect is not what is actually occurring. So if you think of a privacy breach, you thought your information was secure, and guess what? Someone else has got it. That's not what you expected. So there's been a change in the state of privacy. So a lot of the way that we're trying to engineer solutions to this is to establish a state machine around privacy. And the state machine around privacy basically tracks two things. So in this case, it takes you to this data controller registry, I think. I actually have an open tab elsewhere, but it's actually somewhat working, which is good. And you go and you see, here's ID Machines registered as a data controller. We're a Massachusetts company, and that's one of the two things you need to track. You need to track the legal entity, and you need the beneficial owner of the information from a business basis. And then you need to track the policy. So if you look at what we track on this page, one of the things we track is what's going on with my privacy policy. So you can see any changes that I made to my privacy policy right then and there. We would also have pushed out a notice to you if you were a customer of ours for that. Because right now it's incumbent upon you to know when a privacy policy is changed or when a company has been sold. How are you going to do that, right? I changed, right, literally, right? Well, we decided that, that guarantee that we gave you, no longer. And current law basically says, well, you got to keep up to date with the privacy policy. Well, operationally, that's a non-starter. From my proportionality and reciprocity principles I talked about earlier, fail. So that's not great. And then the other thing, of course, is you want to track the actual company itself, right? So if you register with this, what we call this open network, we actually track all this stuff for you and provide a real-time signal. And the last piece of it, this is a little bit of a pitch, but I hope you don't mind, is that we can actually, we actually create a dashboard for the data controller as well. So here's a data controller dashboard, and he can begin to manage all this stuff. So as an example, if you were changing, so this is me basically doing a hash of my privacy policy, which is a way to say that it hasn't changed effectively. So I go back and I say no change, right? So I'm letting people know at a certain periodicity that I haven't changed and pushing notices out. Guess what? Same as it ever was. And people actually appreciate that at the end of the day. But if you did have a change, we'd allow you to say, I don't know if you can see this. This doesn't allow me to scroll big enough. I can read it for you, right? So no change, non-significant change, significant change, right? And if there's a significant change, then you've got to push out that notice. Sorry. And then, so if I would have said, sorry. Right, and then that gives you an example of what you're going to send out there, right? So non-significant change, we just changed some text, or if it's significant change, but this basically is generating the notices, or a notice is a kind of receipt, right? So there are notice receipts, there are consent receipts, there are all different sorts of receipts that can be generated in the course of this process. This is just showing you how you would generate an updated privacy policy notice receipt automatically as a data controller from that dashboard. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to make all this stuff sort of fly, but we've stuck a toe in the water. I think if you just start with understanding how to do the risk assessment, understanding that you have a public profile, helping to make that public profile something that promotes your brand and helps you manage risk. The second that you do that, you're going to be much better off than anybody else. So do this, lower your risk, do a better job with your privacy, and that's about what I had for you today. I think there's like 2 minutes left, so I don't know if there's another question or two. I think we have time for it. If not, thank you very much. Anybody? No? Cool. All right, thanks, folks.